Before the sun rose over the Texas plains, the camp was already awake. Searchlights still burned faintly against the pale gray sky as a bus rolled through the gates, its tires crunching over gravel. Inside, a handful of German Red Cross nurses sat stiffly, their uniforms faded, faces hollow from weeks of captivity and months of war. The smell inside was a mixture of dust, leather, and fear. None of them spoke. They had crossed an ocean and half a continent under guard, bracing for what they had been told would come: punishment, humiliation, revenge. The bus came to a stop beside a row of wooden barracks. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a soldier's voice called out in English, sharp but not cruel. The doors hissed open, and warm air swept in. It carried something none of them expected: the smell of bacon and coffee. Real coffee. The kind that hadn't been seen in Germany in years. It drifted from a mess hall nearby, heavy and rich, mixing with the faint sweetness of butter hitting a hot pan. One nurse, her cheeks hollowed by rationing, whispered to the woman beside her, "Fleisch, meat." The other shook her head, almost laughing at the absurdity. They had imagined barbed wire and barking dogs, not breakfast. As they stepped down from the bus, the gravel crunched under their boots. The guards stood waiting, rifles slung low, their expressions unreadable. The sky was wide, a deep pink just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was warm, foreign, and full of smells that seemed impossible after years of scarcity. For the first time since their capture, the women felt something they could not name, something closer to disbelief than fear. The war had stripped them of everything familiar. Yet here, on enemy soil, a simple scent blurred the line between captivity and grace. It was the spring of 1945, and the war in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. Cities in Germany burned from nightly bombings, trains carried refugees instead of soldiers, and hospitals ran on scraps. For the nurses who had once served near the front lines, capture had come not in a burst of gunfire but in silence, an end they neither welcomed nor resisted. They had watched the Reich crumble from the inside, tending to boys no older than their brothers, patching wounds with rags when morphine ran out, boiling water over broken stoves. Hunger had become their constant companion. Bread was stretched with sawdust. Soup was little more than hot water flavored with memory. When American forces advanced through the last German defenses, surrender came quickly. The nurses were separated from the wounded they had tried to save, loaded onto trucks, and handed over to U.S. units whose language they could not understand. Rumors followed them across the sea. That American camps were cruel, that prisoners were beaten or starved, that no one ever returned. Fear hardened into silence. Now, as the bus rolled deeper into Texas, the nurses pressed their hands to the windows and saw only miles of empty land. It felt like exile on another planet. The United States, untouched by bombs, was vast and clean, its sky too large to comprehend. Yet beneath their exhaustion lingered the instinct to brace for pain. They had served a nation that promised glory and delivered ruin. They had believed the enemy would mirror their own collapse. Instead, they found themselves in a land that seemed absurdly untouched by war. The contrast itself was almost unbearable. Something inside them began to tremble, not from hunger this time, but from the slow realization that everything they had been told might have been a lie. Morning in the camp began with the clatter of tin trays and the faint hum of a generator dying down from the night watch. The nurses, still unsure of their place, stood in line under the pale Texas sun as guards called roll in crisp, practiced voices. The air smelled of dust and cooking grease. Beyond the wire, the horizon stretched endlessly flat. No ruins, no sirens, no hunger. Felt unreal. When breakfast came, it wasn't punishment. Each woman was handed a plate: bread, eggs, and a thin strip of bacon. The sight of it stirred something close to disbelief. One nurse hesitated, glancing toward the guard, as if waiting for the food to be taken back. Another whispered, "Is this allowed?" The guard only nodded for them to move along. The first bite nearly brought tears. Salt and fat, flavors long forgotten, flooded their mouths. For a few seconds, the war seemed to recede. The routine was strange in its calm. Guards watched closely but spoke evenly. Orders were given without shouting. They were prisoners, but the rhythm of camp life had an order that felt almost civilized. In the afternoons, the nurses were taken to the infirmary to clean instruments, change linens, and assist with simple tasks. The smell there was sharp: alcohol, disinfectant, iron from dried blood, but everything was organized, stocked, and impossibly abundant. On the shelves were bottles of penicillin, a sight that made them stop mid-step. In Germany, such medicine had become myth. Evenings brought a different silence. The women sat in their quarters writing letters home, each word measured, knowing their pages would be read by censors. Still they wrote, "I am safe. I am fed." The guilt of those words pressed heavy. Beyond the walls, their families faced rubble and starvation. Yet here they were, fed by the enemy, treated with restraint instead of cruelty. The contradiction grew harder to bear each day. Between the smell of soap, the warmth of coffee, and the distant sound of laughter from the guards' barracks, the nurses began to understand that captivity could wound in quieter, more complicated ways. It began with a rumor. One morning, the nurses noticed an extra guard posted near the infirmary and whispers passing between the Americans. Something had happened at another camp, an escape attempt, someone said, a shooting, maybe worse. The next day, the routine changed. Their movements were counted more strictly, the tone of the orders sharpened. The same men who had once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. It was as if the thin layer of decency had cracked overnight, revealing what war still carried beneath its surface. That afternoon, a nurse named Latte was caught pocketing a small bar of soap. It wasn't theft so much as reflex, an instinct left over from rationing and deprivation. The guard who found her said nothing at first. He just stared at her hand, then at the soap, before taking her by the arm and leading her outside. The camp fell silent. No one moved. They expected shouting, maybe worse. But the guard stopped a few steps away, took the soap back, and tossed it into a bucket of water. "You don't have to steal here," he said quietly. His voice wasn't cruel, just tired. Then he walked away. That night, Latte sat on her bunk staring at her hands, shaking. The others said nothing. There was no punishment, no humiliation, just the unbearable knowledge that mercy could feel as heavy as shame. Outside, the floodlights hummed against the dark. The air smelled of damp soil after rain. Somewhere across the camp, an American radio played a song about home. In that moment, the nurses began to understand the war's cruel paradox. That kindness, when given by an enemy, could wound deeper than hate. It stripped them of the comfort of being victims, forcing them to face their own part in the machinery of suffering. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was recognition, and it lingered long after the song faded into static. Months passed, marked only by the rhythm of meals and the slow drift of seasons. The nurses' hair grew out, their faces filled back in. The camp garden bloomed with sunflowers, tall and defiant against the wire fence. Letters from home came less often, and when they did, they were thin, ink-smudged, words desperate but brief. One message told of Dresden's ruins. Another spoke of a brother missing since the last days on the Eastern Front. Every envelope carried more silence than news. By late summer, word spread that repatriation was coming. Some would be sent home, others reassigned. The nurses didn't cheer. Home no longer felt real. Germany was gone in the way a person dies. Slowly, completely, leaving behind only the shape of what once was. The Americans, too, seemed uncertain how to treat them now. The war was ending, but nobody quite knew how to stop behaving like soldiers. On the final morning, as the bus waited beyond the gate, an older guard approached one of the nurses. She had once cleaned his arm after a kitchen burn, a small kindness neither of them had mentioned since. He handed her a folded handkerchief, plain white, no insignia. "For the road," he said simply. She nodded, unable to speak. When the bus pulled away, the camp shrank into the horizon, swallowed by the flat Texas light. Through the window, the nurse held the handkerchief tightly, its fabric still carrying the faint scent of soap and smoke. It was nothing, and it was everything. a reminder that the war had not completely stripped the world of gentleness, only hidden it where few dared to look. As the desert gave way to distance, she realized the strange truth of their captivity. They had survived not by hatred or loyalty, but by fragments of mercy from those they had been taught to despise. The war was ending, but its questions would not. Some would carry medals, others scars. She would carry a handkerchief. Years later, when the nurses were old women and the world had moved on to new wars, few people remembered that German prisoners had once lived quietly in the heart of Texas. The camps had been dismantled, their wooden barracks torn down or turned into barns. Only the concrete foundations remained, scattered across farmland like forgotten gravestones. Locals spoke of the time when the Germans worked in the fields, polite and obedient, as if the war had been something that happened somewhere else. For those who had lived through it, the memory was heavier. Many of the nurses never returned to hospitals or uniforms. They married, raised families, or drifted between small jobs in post-war Germany. A few wrote letters to the men who had guarded them, unsure why. Some letters were answered. Most were not. What endured was not the captivity itself, but the confusion it left behind, the uneasy realization that kindness could exist even inside a war built on cruelty. Historians would later describe the American POW program as humane, a small mercy in a brutal century. But for the women who lived it, that word felt too clean. Humanity, they had learned, was not purity but contradiction. Compassion twisted with guilt, survival mixed with shame. They had eaten the enemy's bread, used his soap, accepted his pity. No victory parade could make sense of that. On her deathbed, one of the former nurses kept a small box beside her. Inside, a folded handkerchief, its edges yellowed with time. Her granddaughter once asked what it was. The old woman smiled faintly and said, "Proof that even enemies can be gentle." Then she closed her eyes, leaving behind a silence that felt larger than war itself. A silence that asked whether mercy, too, might carry its own kind of wound.